Hello, my name is Daniel Stillwell. I am the editor of the IFTA e-newsletter. We are here in Aberdeen, Scotland at the Congress 2025. And so we have with us today Diane Gehart. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So you gave a presentation earlier in the Congress about a unifying framework. Tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so unifying frameworks, they are different than theories in that a theory really explains why people do what they do, why we have problems. Then you come up with interventions based on all of that about what to do about those problems. Where a unifying framework, it kind of synthesizes a lot of different concepts into just some basic kind of looking for those places of overlap. And it kind of boils it down. And in this case, my unifying framework for family therapy is about just a system for what to do in the room. I don't explain why or what, but it's really synthesizing all of the knowledge in the field into a single, streamlined, evidence-informed system for doing, because I think there's that much overlap in the field.
Yeah, I definitely have heard people talk about how, there's 400 models, but they're all just kind of explaining the same thing. So how did you find the common threads?
Well, not intentionally. It was totally unintentional. And it's really being a textbook author, oddly enough. And so for the last, 25 years, I've been writing these theory textbooks. I've done them for family therapy, and I've done them for traditional counseling and psychotherapy theories. And over the years, all of those theories got crammed into one little brain. And when I was writing, the other thing I did is I really tried to describe what the therapist did in the room rather than, and to really focus on that in my work. So to really get to the nitty gritty about what people were doing. And so, there would be things where you're like, okay, so in narrative therapy, we talk about unique outcomes or sparkling moments, right? And so this is when the problem narrative, you would have expected the problem ending, but you got a different one, right? There's a unique outcome. And so you compare that to solution-focused therapy, where you're looking for exceptions. It's the main thing they assess for, right? And so, but exceptions are when the problem could have happened, but it didn't. Now, theoretically, they are totally different concepts. They are truly, honest to God, different concepts. There was a conference once where Steve DeShazer and Michael White debated how these are different, and it was written up. I have it on my bookshelf at home, and theoretically, they are different. But to the person sitting in the room, they don't really, it doesn't matter. When you're sitting there talking to another human, trying to do therapy, you're just like, when could the problem have happened? When did it not happen? And so those theoretical distinctions are really distractions, I think. I think they're problematic when you're in the room. I think theory is beautiful when you're outside of the room. But over the years of training, when you're in the room, what matters most is what's happening between you and the client, that therapeutic presence, that connection. All the research talks about that. And so what we need is, and I realize even when I do my own work, I spend very little time going off into theoretical constructs, because then you're not present, you're not in the moment, you're in some book you read, two months ago, or a workshop you went to a year ago.
Yeah.
So the unifying framework uses very little jargon, but it kind of synthesizes everything into, there are 6 basic components.
Okay.
Should I go kind of walk you through those?
Sure.
So the first one is, and I think lots of people at the conference have been talking about this, is about the self of the clinician and your way of being in the world, and really kind of coming up with, I'm not going to use the word self-care because I don't like it.
Sure.
It's been used to the point of meaninglessness, but it's how do you live your life as a human being when you do this work without burning out, and so that you're constantly, slowly, growing in all areas of wellness. And I look at both emotional, obviously, and physical health and relationships, but also just your ability to manage time and money, personal effectiveness. Those are life skills you need to understand to really, be great at this work. And there's looking at career-wise and just, are you enjoying your life? So kind of making sure that we live 360 as whole human beings on our life path. So I think that's part one.
Yeah.
But I use micro habits. We're all so busy. So how do we take whatever life goal you have and break it down to 1 to 5 minute chunks you can be consistent with? So that's the self, the clinician. And then part 2, module 2, is really, I'm sorry, I think in modules because I teach it as a class. Right. So the second part is really the therapeutic relationship, and I refer to that as collaborative connecting. But And so I draw heavily on the postmodern concepts, social constructionist concepts, but also on interpersonal neurobiology. And so I think, empathy is great, and that is first semester in graduate school. But what the research shows, regardless of your theory, just outcome research is finding, there's a whole a group of psychologists looking at this, it's about this attuned communication. There's a group that's calling it responsiveness, and they're measuring it as the therapist's ability to, in the moment, have this highly attuned communication. And I love the work of Dan Siegel, where he talks about getting into relational attunement, and you can measure the brain waves kind of get in sync. When you feel like you're in sync with someone, there's actually something happening there that they can measure in our brain waves. And so it's that quality of connection that you need to have, and that when you learn how to really get in sync like that, and the piece I add to that is entering what I call the client's meaning-making system. Sure. Which is understanding how they see the world. And this is programmed by our childhood family of origin issues, obviously, cultural discourses, religious beliefs, there's so much, your friendships, what social media channels you follow, all of that fuels how you interpret your life. And so when you step into someone's meaning-making system, the metaphor I have come to use over the years, it's a strange one, is this metaphor of something called holodeck, which is from the Star Trek Enterprise 20, 30 years ago. So my younger students, they have to Google it. But and it's the only metaphor I know of where it's this room on the starship where it's a recreation room, right? But the user came in and programmed the world. They programmed, what type of world you're seeing, the characters in it. And so, understanding that when you're talking to another human being, they have a totally different holodeck, a whole different world and system for interpreting the same set of experiences than you are. Right. But in their world, right, if they say the word lion, a lion in their universe can be a grazing animal who is a prey animal, not, and the gazelle can be the top predator in their world. You don't know, and the only tool you have is asking, because you're blindfolded in their meaning-making system. You don't know anything. Clouds can commonly be found on the ground, rocks can commonly float. You don't know till you bump into something, and you're like, what is that? And they're like, that's just a rock. You're like, it's floating in midair. I'm like, that's how it works here. You're like, what? And so, I think over time we learn, right? We sit down with clients and you make these little assumptions. I was sharing my session yesterday. I once was interviewing this couple. They'd been together for 35 years, and they got into an argument, before they came to session. Of course, they're all huffy. They're coming in, and she's this, and he this, and I'm listening to all this, and, I just paused, and I slowed down to ask, so what did he say? Oh, he didn't say anything. And what did she didn't say anything. I'm like, you had an argument without speaking? That doesn't happen in my universe. In my holodeck, there are words that are part of arguments. They'd been together so long, they could literally put the brush down and slam a door, and everyone knew what everyone was upset about. No words were spoken. But it's so easy to make an assumption, right? That if they came and said they had an argument, I assumed there were words involved, but there weren't. And so it's learning how to really, we talked about not knowing, right? And some of the postmodern stuff, being curious. The intensity of that should take 99% of your brain power when you're in dialogue with a client, because it takes so much discipline, and there's no way to ever coast, even with the same client. I have some clients I've literally seen on and off for 20 years since they were teenagers, and they can still come in and blow me away with, oh my God, I had no idea you would have experienced that situation in this way, right? And so, it's learning to be, there's a whole discipline to it, and not knowing, being curious, assume nothing, even with the same client. If they look like you, you're more likely to make assumptions and project onto them, or judge them, actually. And so learning to have this intense curiosity, this intense not knowing, and to be really curious and disciplined in how you do that. And so I think all of us think we're non-judgmental. We all think we're curious, but it's actually really hard work, even after doing this for years and years. I never coast in a session. I'm still 100% focused on what the client's saying, and it's hard not to do that. So.
I know that in the international community, the idea of cultural humility has supplanted cultural competence, and I think that's a lot of what you're getting at.
Yes, absolutely. The cultural humility is very much in line with this. You just can't assume anything. That still means you should educate yourself as much as you can to sort of have a sense of how the roadmap might look, but then realizing every single person in every culture has a totally unique interpretation of their own dominant discourse, right? And it's slowing down, being patient. And the technique I use to teach that is to get the movie, so as best as you can, of course every word is loaded with cultural meaning, but what happened as if a video camera was seeing and hearing it. That's how I discovered the couple didn't say anything, because sometimes you think you're asking the dumbest question in the world, right? And sometimes it's like the most important question you can ask because it's so obvious, But then it's like, so this is what happened, and then how did you interpret that? And then, getting curious if the interpretation doesn't make sense to you, getting curious, well, how did that, slamming of the hairbrush down, which was part of the argument they had, how did that hairbrush, hitting the counter, how did you interpret that to understand she was upset with what you were wearing? I forget what it was. How did you know that? Where'd that come from? And so you get the stories and you kind of unravel that, and you begin to understand how they make sense of their world, and you just try to understand it. And so that's the therapeutic relationship in this approach. But as you're slowing down the meaning-making process and having them put that into words. Like for this couple, for example, what happens is they become more consciously aware of how they interpret. Because most of us, things happen, we feel angry, sad, or happy about it, and we don't think much beyond why we feel angry and it's happening. So the clients begin to see and make connections that they didn't make before. Just as you just slow down and try to get the movie and the interpretation, the movie and the interpretation. Sometimes it's like, oh, well, that is how my mom always, described things or whatever, right? And so you're kind of like going through, and that's the therapeutic relationship. So there's it's got a strong, I would say, postmodern ethos to it. The cultural humility piece, and it's also the interpersonal neurobiology. It's got some neurobiology in there. And then the third part is is really the case conceptualization, which I think you'll see has a heavy systemic piece to it, which is once you're mapping, going on a tour of the client's holodeck, and you're all like, blindfolded, at a certain point you're going to stumble, hopefully, upon a good example of the problem, right? Like this argument with my partner. And the problem can be intrapsychic or it can be interpersonal. And once you get, so this is the type of argument you usually have, or this is what a panic episode or depression episode.
Whatever the symptom problem thing is, right?
This is a good example of that, right? If you have a couple, you always have to ask, because if you don't, at the end, the other person's like, well, that wasn't a good example because I look bad. But I have learned that one. And then what we do is you slow them down, and you're going to use the interactional sequence that we have used in family therapy, and I'm sure most people listening to this are well aware that, the research is pretty clear. When you have a complex chronic problem, the evidence base says bring in more people, think systemically, because systemic thinking and really analyzing that interactional cycle is really key in having more perspectives. So you slow it down and you look at what's homeostasis. So like for a couple, it might be when they're getting along well. For depression, it's the least depressed moment during the day is, what depression is, because it often doesn't go away. And then you look at how the symptom rises, how the tension rises between the couple, or the depression starts to get worse. And then you get to the symptom at its worst, right? So that's your most severe depression symptoms, or the ugly part of the argument, and then how things get back to normal. So we're familiar with that, right? Every person listening to this, I think, will know that. And then what you do is you kind of we look at it and ask about 4 different levels. So we call it 4-level assessment. And the most basic level is behavioral, so that's what the video camera would see. But you're also looking for those complementary patterns, right? Like pursuer, distancer, overfunctioner, underfunctioner. Intrapsychically, it could be, you're kind of in a stressed out mode, and then you totally check out, right? It could be those 2 types of, even a mood can shift, right? Complementary moods. And then the next level is emotional. And so you're looking for as the whole cycle ebbs and flows, what are the emotions like in neutral or homeostasis? What are the emotions It's a couple for each person. Symptom rises, emotions when things are at the worst, and when it gets back together. And we're looking for both attachment emotions. I think of it as emotional safety is often what I call it with my clients, as well as, the secondary emotions, as some folks would call it, the anger, sadness, guilt, shame.
More responsive.
Yeah, more responsive, types of emotions. So then you look at how the emotions ebb and flow in the cycle. The level 3 is cognitive, but that has 2 parts. There's cognition, which I think of it as kind of the cognitive behavioral, schemas, beliefs, those sorts of things. But then also, when we all hook together all of our beliefs and schemas, we end up with an identity narrative. So kind of a more postmodern way of thinking of cognition is the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. So then you look at how their beliefs, thoughts, and identity narrative shift when they're at homeostasis, as things get tense, things at their worst. And so that's always my favorite level. It's very fascinating to hear how especially identity narratives can shift, from one to the one part of the cycle to the other, how you're feeling really good about yourself, and as the symptoms get worse, and then the narrative you have about yourself when things are at their worst, and how they come back together. And then the top level is kind of societal discourses. And I guess I should add, your identity narratives can have a lot of family of origin discourses in them, and you can also find a lot of your family discourses can be connected to social location, like age, religion, culture, social economic class, education, all those sorts of diversity variables, the graces, as they call them at the conference here in the plenary, as well as just stories about society has about people who have problems like yours, right? So societal discourse is about your problem and your own, and how you've taken those in and interpreted those. And we live in an interesting time with ADHD, for example, right? There were times, 20, 30 years ago, I'm old enough to remember back then, where, that was just this very kind of embarrassing thing. No one said anything. And now, you'll hear people talk about it as a superpower. And they're very proud of it, right? They wear it, So you can have both. Which discourse is affecting your client and in what ways, and where are they getting it from? And what do their parents think? What does the client think? So you're listening for all of these sorts of beliefs. And so maybe when they're at homeostasis, they're very proud of their label with ADHD. But once the symptom's at its worst, then it comes rushing in all these negative ones. And so at different points in the cycle, different discourses can be affecting them in different ways, or they buy into this comment that their parent or whoever said at some point, or a teacher said. And so that's that top level of the cycle to just kind of, it's fascinating because we think we have one identity narrative or we have one version of the problem. But these societal discourses, which ones are influencing you, actually ebb and flow across the cycle. I've discovered over time which ones you're kind of pulling from. And that's why what social media, what kind of entertainment our clients are listening to are very powerful. Because those kick in. Down. They really do trickle down and they seep in. It's just a movie. I'm like, I just wait till the symptom's at its worst. Guess what movie's playing in your head and what story you're telling yourself. And so that's what we call the 4-level assessment in case conceptualization. And it kind of pulls together all the different systemic theoretical approaches in a beautiful way, I feel like. Because, the humanistic ones are all Satir, Carl Whitaker, all in that, emotional one. Actually, CBT, structural, and strategic, they both hang out on 2 different levels. They do the behavioral parts and the cognitive one, where the postmodern folks are kind of at societal and that little layer of the identity narrative. But you can begin to see how all of these, I forgot solution focus. Solution focus hangs out with the CBT and strategic structural folks. And so you begin to see how all these theories kind of can fit together and work together. And what I like about this is, even if, let's say you're a structural family therapist, that's your cup of tea. Using this 4-level assessment, even if you theoretically work primarily from a structural lens, it reminds you to, did you check in on emotions? Did you check on the societal part, right? And if you're, tend to be more, let's say, EFT, and you hang out in that emotional level, like, did we check behavior, cognitive, and societal? So it just kind of helps fill in the gaps and just helps you think more robustly, I think, about whatever's going on. And it allows you to use whatever you've trained in more easily. You can jump between, I feel like I'm jumping between layers of a cake. I don't know how it feels to me. Yeah. You're kind of jumping back and forth, but it's all the symptom cycle. And so it's very, that's the conceptualization piece. And let's see, then once you have a conceptualization, you also get a really detailed description of the problem, obviously. You go through those 4 levels and all the different, sequence. So then you get a diagnosis, and the idea here is to run it just, what does the evidence base say about whatever your problem is? Because certain things like anxiety and major depressive disorder, most things tend to work, right? Where other problems like OCD, couple conflict, teen, conduct issues, they're only very specific things. The evidence is very, very clear, like structural, strategic for conduct, teen conduct and substance use disorders, right? Exposure and relapse prevention for OCD. The research is very clear, and that doesn't mean we cram this down our clients' throats.
Of course.
But we inform them that chances are with OCD, 95% chance this very uncomfortable intervention is going to work best, which is exposure therapy. We're going to expose you to what you hate the most or fear the most, and you're going to have to sit there for 45 minutes. But I'll help you breathe. I joke, but it's not fun. But the clients then have informed consent. And then kind of moving on, we take that entire 4-level assessment around the problem and we flip it and we do a 4-level assessment of the solution and of what's going right. And that's really important when working with marginalized clients, because if you're marginalized societally in your community or even within your family, right? You can be the odd one out in your own family and feel very marginalized. In either case, there are not people around you who are mirroring your new identity, your competent identity, right? There are people who probably aren't seeing you as competent or they're not able to really resonate with this new identity that you have. And so that is why this 4-level assessment around the solution you go into. So what exactly did you do? And how are you feeling about yourself and others as you did this new behavior, let's say? And what kind of thoughts and beliefs were different did you have when you did this? And how did you feel about who you were as a person, right? And then societally, how does that fit with your social location and the dominant discourses and what it feels like society says your value is or isn't, right? And this is actually where you get a lot of tears. It's very deep emotional work, especially for marginalized clients, to put together, and it's this thick description. I don't know if I did qualitative research in grad school. And so this thick, rich description of this new identity of who they are kind of cements it a lot more deeply. And for anyone who's experiencing any form of marginalization, it's really powerful. I mean, it's powerful for anyone just experiencing trouble that was bad enough to see a therapist about. Celebrating and really thickening that description is real important. And so also towards the end, looking at cultivating equanimity, which is a concept I drew from Buddhist psychology. I've had folks come up through the conference saying, oh yeah, that relates to some other, concepts as well. But I really feel like in the 21st century, there is so much uncertainty around the globe. I mean, with climate, with politics, with health issues, pandemics, there's a lot of uncertainty. And our old 20th century idea of self-actualization or attaining secure attachment and pursuing happiness, I'm feeling like we should rewrite some constitutions here, those are I think not the right model for mental health anymore. I think equanimity is the ability to move gracefully with life's ups and downs. It allows you to kind of surf and move with what's going on around you and life constantly changing. And I think we need to cultivate that in ourselves as well as our clients to be able to withstand kind of just the uncertainty and the radical, rapid changes we keep experiencing, many of which are very unpleasant, right? And so the model of mental health we use is equanimity in this approach. How do you move gracefully with life's ups and downs? So making sure your clients are able to do that. And as part of that, I talk about cultivating what I call the 5 pillars of wellness. And this really is drawing from general positive psychology and wellness research, but the 5 pillars of wellness are not shocking. You need, to be able to have some kind of healthy, ways of eating, healthy exercise, right? Sleep, quality sleep, a social support network, and healthy coping, which is more than a margarita on the beach.
Right,
I'm talking meditation, journaling, even exercise. Some people exercise intentionally for mental health. You have a stressful day, you go for a run. But to have a tool bag of what to do when life gets stressful. And so I make sure my clients are set up with a lifestyle, because we now are learning more and more that our mental and physical health are really more related, and the relational health piece too. All three of those really go together. And to just think, because my client isn't fighting with their partner anymore, or that they say they're less depressed, I haven't set them up for a lifetime of wellness, and that's real important to me, to have this lifetime wellness, model for wellness. So that's that's the unifying framework in a nutshell.
And it sounds like a lot of it also goes back to the systemic ideas of functionality over morality a little bit.
Yes, sure.
Like, how do we find alignment between those four levels in a way that works for us and the people around us?
Correct.
When you're working with students, with colleagues who are maybe early career, how do you help them find the grounding that most of us had with theoretical stuff, so that they don't only learn sort of what works in the room without any theory? Or maybe that's not a problem. I don't know.
Well, the framework is a system for what to do in the room. And you can ground yourself in pretty much any theoretical orientation and still use the framework.
So you're not worried that people will treat it like its own theory?
Well, will they treat it like it's a theory? I think that, I encourage them to, ground themselves in a formal theory, but the framework is a system for what to do in that room. And my experience is it gives people a lot of confidence and clarity about where to go, what to ask, what not to ask, how to be present. And that I think everyone I've met so far seems to have a natural interest in one theory or another. And that I don't need to push that very hard. So in my experience, everyone's gone through a graduate program, because I'm not, so everyone's been trained in something usually by the time they come to me. But I think they find using this framework is very grounding in what to do, and their skill level, I think, grows rapidly. But along with that, I think then they feel much more confident in, I want to go learn this theory, or I want to specialize in couples. I'm going to go learn some emotionally focused couples therapy or integrative behavioral couples therapy type thing. Or I really like the narrative and the postmodern societal discourses. I'm going to go work on that and specialize in that. So it's almost like the theory allows them to specialize in an area of interest and to go deeper in that area. But I think there's a huge comfort in knowing there's one framework I can use with kids, couples, adults, individuals, for interpsychic issues, couple issues, family issues. There's just one basic thing I do, and that it's just different with every client. And I think the specialization is where you go off into the various theories that kind of resonate.
Okay.
You go deeper.
One thing that the international audience often talks about from their own location is how most countries' versions of this are run by the state system, run by hospitals, run by medical models and psychologists and psychiatrists. What you're describing is far more outpatient style, whatnot.
Yes.
What would this look like in more of an institutional setting?
So in an institutional setting, and I'm going to think of maybe a county mental health type setting, I imagine it, being used as a framework for talking about what to do in session. There is evidence-informed intervention and treatment planning that are kind of in the middle piece, but it can be used as a language to talk about what you're doing, and so I think it's just a framework for training in a lot of ways, and especially in supervision, it becomes a very easy way to kind of work through multiple supervisees' cases in a quick, efficient way where everyone's following along rather than everyone having a different theoretical framework. What's also really nice is that, especially if you're in a place where you don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to train a team in an evidence-based treatment, which in smaller countries and smaller, more rural areas, that's not happening there. This becomes a very efficient tool to use in those contexts, because you can do supervision on multiple types of cases, using roughly the same language and the same framework rather than, I think, switching gears. And I think this switching gears we now have therapists doing with highly manualized treatments is very draining and stressful on the clinician to have like 1 hour I am using EFT. Next, I'm going to be doing dialectic behavior therapy. Next, I'm doing Jungian centric. Oh my God, it's variety, but you're constantly, that's more taxing than having one kind of basic thing that's going to look very different. You can do child therapy or couple therapy or different types, but at least it's one system that you're using that everything gets filtered through. So I think it works better in those sorts of contexts. If you're in a large enough organization where they've got everyone can get manualized, you got a team of whoever all using the same thing, then maybe it's not as necessarily central.
Well, and I like this idea of supervision because not everybody has students or training programs or whatnot, but the idea of consultation, supervision, that's pretty pervasive across the globe. And the people watching this or thinking about this can maybe just occasionally sneak in one of the four that no one else is talking about as a way to round out our systemic worldview. Yeah, absolutely. Using that 4-level assessment, it keeps you grounded and it keeps you kind of holistic, is what I like. Yeah. I do hear a lot of people wanting to attend to the whole person, but it takes so much time, so much energy, so much effort, and so having a structure to streamline that taxes us less and allows us to be more present. Yeah,
and even something as simple as the 5 pillars. I have some people, I have some therapists who've come back and said, you know what, Diane, you know what I use the most of all your complex, theory is the 5 pillars. My clients love it. They intuitively know it helps, so they use the 5 pillars the most, which is so simple, right, and intuitive, but it's something we don't emphasize a lot, and there are clients. I remember once I had a client come in, he was severely depressed, wasn't going to do medication. I'm like, what's helped in the past? He's like, oh yeah, when I used to run every morning, I was never depressed. I'm like, well, why don't we just start there?
Go outside, walk somewhere.
Maybe we just start there.
Well, and I think for especially the students or the supervisees that I work with, they want all of their metrics to be psychologically based. And using something like sleep as a metric, I'm not treating your sleep, but I can pay attention to your sleep. If it improves or gets closer to your healthy margin, maybe we're doing something.
Yeah. And in this Zoom-based world, even high school students who are in these highly hybrid school things, sometimes they come in and, when do you go to bed? 2, 4 in the morning. And I'm like, okay, and you're anxious and depressed. Well, let's just move that back to get you on a somewhat more normal rhythm. And wow, anxiety and depression and focus got a lot better, right?
Right.
And there's these simple things that I probably didn't spend as much time thinking about earlier in my career. And teenagers stay up late, but the research is saying, it's not good for them. It's not, and it's correlated with this escalation in depression and anxiety that we're seeing. Where I live in the state of California, they started new laws where you can't start high school before 8:30 because there's so much research as to what that was doing to their brain development, because they're all staying up till midnight, and they weren't changing the bedtimes, so they started changed the school start time. So these little things, we want to psychologize everything, and it's sometimes realizing there can be a physiological piece, and that's why always checking in on where those 5 pillars are is so critical early in treatment. Like, I have several people with depression. We skipped the medication, went straight to exercise and sleep and healthy diet, and they got much better.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's just important to know that that's an option, I think.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Any other takeaways that you think would work from a international multicultural lens?
I think one of the things I love about this framework, and what I've gotten good feedback about, is that top level of the societal discourse. So when you are working with an individual couple or family and you're thinking systemically, to not forget to ask about how those discourses affect, when you're assessing that the interaction cycle, right? The homeostasis, rise of tension, things at its worst, to make sure you kind of look at ways to draw in the social location type elements. I've had a lot of therapists say it just feels more natural and they're more comfortable asking about it because it's connected to something rather than just kind of being this add-on that you have. But how do you think gender plays out in this interaction pattern we described? Like with couples, oh my God, that's always fascinating, right? How did you feel about yourself as a husband and wife at the beginning, if they're a heterosexual couple, and then when things are at their worst? Two totally different discourses around gender identity, right? And just having them say that out loud is often very eye-opening for each of them and what they're doing. And so you can do the same with, religious beliefs and racial and ethnic identities, and all that pulls into the family of origin. And it's all embedded in this interaction cycle. And so it's really just remembering that that's always kind of in the background or floating on top, however you imagine it, and to invite that in when you discuss those patterns.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about CLS, collaborative language systems, and like the language of culture, how that goes all the way down to what do we do behaviorally.
Yeah, exactly.
So very nice.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for being here, for explaining the framework. Hopefully the people watching this or learning about this will look you up. You've got websites and all sorts of things.
I do.
So Dr. Diane Gehart is someone you will definitely want to pay attention to, and go to her website, find the resources, take the courses, all the things. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.